the absence of truth.
That's good. That's really good. The idea of light and darkness. And so you take that literal light and darkness language of Genesis 1 and creation and all of that stuff unfolding, and you get to John 1, and he's describing Jesus as, oh yeah, by the way, Jesus was there, and everything was made through him. And he's talking to this woman, and what? Revealing things. There's light and darkness, and things coming to light, and life and sin, and okay, because what does he talk to this woman about? Bring your husband. Why does he ask her that? Because I don't have a husband. Right. You don't have a husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the guy you're with is not your husband. Why is that even in the story? Sin. And so there's light, and there's revealing the truth, and there's sin, and there's like all this stuff. See, this is what's so neat about this passage and a lot of passages of Scripture. This isn't just unique to John 4. But it's so neat about this particular passage is you broaden back out a little bit, and all of a sudden some of these things start making sense. Okay? Anything else? How about this? Let's move forward to Genesis 2. How is humanity created? You can just recount it if you know it. Genesis 2. Dust.
In the image of God.
What's that?
The image of God.
In the image of God. Do you know who Terence Fredheim is? He's an Old Testament scholar, and I quoted him a bunch in my thesis. The passages I was dealing with, he had written a lot on. He has a book called The Suffering of God that is incredible. And it's about the way we view God and the way God interjects himself into our creation and lives in our creation. And he was actually in Kansas City last week, and so a friend of mine was at Nazarene Theological Seminary, invited me. I got to sit in on the class. And Dr. Fredheim said this. He goes, I want you to picture this. I want you to picture God, the best you can do this now. I know this is hard. Picture God in some kind of form, human form or whatever, knelt down in the dirt in Genesis 2. And it says he formed us out of the dust of the earth. And then it says, and he breathed into man. He goes, give it a CPR look. Formed, put his face down to the face of humanity in. Okay? So, we already talked about spirit, how this connects us to God. And Dr. Fredheim is saying, don't lose sight of Genesis 2 because this story of creation. So, anybody here, have you had Greek yet? Anybody know? Okay. This word for spirit, you remember it? Pneuma. How far did you go?
I only took one.
But okay, you've completed a year, okay? And pneuma means what? It means spirit, but what else is it?
Breath.
Breath, or wind, or that idea. Equally, you can translate it each direction. Anybody have Hebrew?
A little bit.
A little bit?
No, it's just the beginning of it.
Okay, you've had a little bit? A little bit. Okay, here?
Yeah.
You like just started here?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're 3 weeks in?
Uh-huh.
Be gracious. Okay. I'm a year of it at Lincoln, and I still feel very, very inadequate in Hebrew. Okay, so this Hebrew word, one of the Hebrew words for spirit, and the one in Genesis 2 is ruach. Okay. Basically the same definition as the Greek pneuma. Okay. Breath, wind, that idea. Spirit. So Genesis chapter 2, what is it?
Isn't that's also the same word in Genesis 1 too, isn't it? Does it do the same? I think it's the same.
Ruach is right here. Spirit of God. Okay, so picture that. Spirit of God's hovering over the surface of the waters. What's another word for spirit? Wind. There's this movement. It's cool, and you start imagining it. So you have all these words here: wind and spirit and breath. Okay. So let's work on our phrase here. And is it expanding our view of spirit at all? It's becoming really personal, isn't it? Because what you're starting to see here then is not this abstract God who is way back. Because if we read Genesis 1 and you read it from like this real logical perspective, and God was hovering over the surface of the waters, and he went wham, wham, and Zeus with lightning bolts throwing them down, and things were happening. But what Genesis 2 does for us is that God's in the dirt, making humanity, breathes spirit, same word, breathes spirit, breathes life, spirit to spirit, life in him. Okay, so suddenly our word spirit isn't this really distant word. It's becoming a very emotional word and a very dear word. Okay, so let's. I want you guys to give me any other scriptures in between here, between Genesis and John that deal with like water, spirit, and those kinds of stuff. You don't have to know the exact reference. You can just like the idea.
Jesus' baptism in the Gospels.
In what?
I said in any of the Gospels you want to choose.
We've got Jesus' baptism.
The use of water to purify or cleanse before offerings.
All kind and like incredible amounts of different kinds of purification rites for different reasons, time frames, but they all have to do with water to purify, water to cleanse. Okay. Any others that come to mind?
Is John 6 okay? Where Jesus
Yeah.
says that he's speaking the words of spirit and life.
Which passage in particular is it?
It's when after he's talked about that he's the bread of life, and then many disciples turn away, and then he says that he speaks word of spirit and life, and then they still turn away, and then Peter confesses that Jesus says the words of eternal life.
There we go. What phrase would I write? What would capture that for you?
I just say spirit and life.
Spirit and
and life.
Okay. All right. Good. What else? Anything around John or back? We had a whole group of baptisms that are for our church last night. For this little lake south of Salina called Lake Blasi, and it's an old sand pit, like extracting sand. And so for Kansas, it's clean water. That's a relative thing. And I grow water in Kansas is generally brown. But this is kind of clean. You could walk behind out and still see your feet. You know what I mean? That's clean for Kansas. And so we were doing these baptisms, and to do the baptism, I introduced the passage from Joshua 3. Okay. Crossing the Jordan. And so let's take a series of events right here. God saves his people from Egypt. And what's the first major encounter after the plagues as they're leaving? Red Sea. Parts the water, and they cross over into the journey. And they spend 40 years in the wilderness, and he provides food for them and all these things. And they have battles, and they sin, and they fall, and then God blesses them, and he plagues them. And like it's an incredible 40 years. And then they come into the promised land, and so they started the journey crossing the water, and they end the journey crossing the water. In Joshua chapter 3, what happens is they come to the Jordan, and they're getting ready to cross with this nation of people. And God says to Joshua, have the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant in front. The Jordan is at flood stage. Have them walk out into the river. And the language of Joshua 3 is God would pile up the water upstream. And as they did that, the river drained out, and the whole nation crossed. And then they did this. He said, take a leader from every tribe, and have them grab a stone out of the middle of the Jordan. They took it out. The priests came out of the water. The Jordan reflooded again. And they built an altar to God so that every time they went by the river and by that altar, they'd remember. Okay? So these water events are salvation events. He parts the Red Sea when Pharaoh's army is pressing in on them. And he saves them by water, and they cross over, and Pharaoh's army chases, and he closes the water. Cross into the Jordan, he parts the water for them. So this water, so you've got you have Exodus, and you have Red Sea, you have Joshua, you have Jordan. Any others?
I don't really know if this goes against it, so I'm not being it down. But what about Noah and the flood?
That's great.
kind of, it seems like it's opposite. It's a lot of destruction.
Yeah, okay, so.
Granted, no, it was safe, so.
Yeah, so present humanity passes for the benefit of future humanity. So even in that, there's two sides to it. You have this idea that yeah, a lot of people perish, but Noah is saved, and the future of humanity is saved as well. So you're right, it's very destructive, and yet it's life-giving at the same time. It's kind of a mixed one. So Genesis 6, anybody know? Genesis 6.